They called him Subject 4A. That was the name printed on the manifest, stenciled on the side of the titanium crate and typed into the mission logs. But to the little girl with the braided hair who visited the lab on Tuesdays, the one who snuck extra dandelion greens through the wire mesh when the technicians weren't looking, he was Barnaby. Barnaby was not built for the stars. He was built for soft dirt, for the smell of rain on clover, and for the safety of a deep, dark burrow. He was a creature of the earth, possessing a heart that beat 300 times a minute and a nose that twitched at the slightest change in the wind. He had no concept of aerodynamics, of escape velocity, or of the cold, unyielding vacuum that lay beyond the blue sky. And yet, here he was, strapped into a harness that felt too tight against his white fur, encased in a metal shell that smelled of ozone and sterilized plastic. The humans had been frantic that morning. Usually, the white-coated giants were calm, moving with slow, deliberate gestures. But today, there was shouting, there were alarms. Barnaby had been placed into the capsule, not for a flight, but for a systems check. That was the rumor among the lab assistants anyway, just a test of the biomonitors. But then the lockdown clamps had engaged with a sound like a heavy door slamming shut forever. The window to the outside world, the one that showed the familiar gray concrete of the launch pad, was suddenly obscured by steam. Barnaby didn't know it, but a sequence had been triggered that could not be stopped. A computer error, a ghost in the machine, a line of code executed at the precise wrong moment. The countdown didn't happen over a loudspeaker. It happened in the sudden, terrifying rumble that shook the very fillings of his teeth. Gravity is a law we take for granted. It is the hand that holds us down. But for Barnaby, that hand suddenly turned into a fist. When the engines ignited, the world didn't just get loud, it ceased to be a place of sound and became a place of violence. The vibration was so intense it blurred his vision. He was pressed back into his seat, the weight of the universe crushing his small chest. He tried to thump his foot, the instinctual warning signal of his kind, but he couldn't move his legs. He couldn't twitch his nose. He could only stare wide-eyed as the blue square of the window turned a deep, bruising purple, and then, finally, into a black so absolute it looked like the end of everything. The pressure lasted for minutes that felt like lifetimes. He was a small, trembling heart in the middle of a pillar of fire rising to the heavens. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the violence stopped. The roar faded into a high-pitched whine, and then into silence. A silence deeper than any winter night. The fist of gravity released him. In fact, it let him go entirely. Barnaby felt his stomach lurch, a sensation of falling that never ended. His long ears, usually pinned back in fear, floated upward. A single droplet of water from his drinking tube drifted out and hovered in the air like a tiny shimmering planet. He was in orbit. He was the first of his kind to see the curve of the world. Through the thick glass of the viewport, he saw it. The blue marble. It didn't look like dirt or grass. It looked like a marble he had once seen a child play with, glowing with a swirling, majestic light. But Barnaby didn't care about the view. He wanted the ground. He wanted the friction of soil. He huddled into a ball, floating against the restraints, waiting for the white-coated giants to open the door and give him a carrot. They didn't come. Hours passed. The capsule, a prototype designated Voyager 1 Alpha, was drifting. The telemetry screens back on Earth were flashing red. The thrusters intended to push him back into a re-entry trajectory had failed to ignite. The math had broken. Barnaby was not just a passenger anymore, he was a castaway. Imagine the isolation. We humans fear loneliness, but we have our thoughts, our words, our ability to rationalize. A rabbit has only its instincts. And every instinct Barnaby had was screaming that this was wrong. There was no scent here. The air was recycled, scrubbed clean of life. It was a dead smell. He floated to the window again. The earth was moving away. Or rather, he was moving away from it. The ship was slowly spinning, turning the window away from the sun, plunging the capsule into a darkness that froze the condensation on the glass. It was in this darkness that Barnaby began to dream, or perhaps hallucinate. As the carbon dioxide levels rose slightly, not to lethal levels, but enough to make the mind wander, Barnaby remembered the field. He remembered the texture of the dandelion leaf. In the vast, star-studded emptiness of space, he saw patterns. To an astronomer, they were constellations, Orion, Ursa Major. To Barnaby, the stars connected to form the shape of a great hawk hanging suspended in the night, waiting to dive. He froze, the primal response. Don't move. If you don't move, the predator can't see you. He hung suspended in the center of the cabin, perfectly still, watching the great starhawk. But the hawk didn't dive. It just stared with a billion unblinking eyes. Back on Earth, the story had broken. The lost rabbit was on every news channel. People who had never looked up at the night sky were now glued to their televisions, watching diagrams of the drifting capsule. They prayed for the animal. They projected their own fears of abandonment onto him. Barnaby, however, was getting thirsty. The water dispenser relied on gravity to feed the tube. In 0G, he had to lick the droplets that floated free. He was tired. A deep lethargy was setting in as the capsule cooled. The heaters were running on reserve power. He curled tighter into himself. In his mind, the metal walls dissolved. He wasn't in a spaceship anymore. He was back in the burrow. The darkness wasn't the void of space. It was the comforting embrace of the earth. The silence wasn't the absence of atmosphere. It was the quiet of winter hibernation. He closed his eyes. Suddenly, a sound. Chick, chick, whoosh. A burst of gas. The ship shuddered. Barnaby's eyes snapped open. The great starhawk shifted in the window. The ship was turning. Ground control had managed a miracle. A Hail Mary pass of code beamed across thousands of miles, bypassing the fried circuits and triggering the emergency maneuvering jets. It was a violent, ungraceful shove. The capsule tumbled. Barnaby was thrown against the padding. The view out the window spun wildly. Black, blue, white, black, blue, white. The centrifugal force pinned him to the wall. He didn't know it, but he was falling again. This wasn't the smooth, floating sensation of orbit. This was the terrifying plummet of a prey animal caught in the talons of the sky. The atmosphere is a shield, but to enter it, you must pay a price in fire. The heat shield on the bottom of the capsule began to glow. Inside, the temperature spiked. The frost on the window turned instantly to steam. The air grew heavy and hot. Barnaby panted, his small chest heaving. The roar returned, louder than before. It sounded like 1,000 wolves howling at the door. The metal groaned and popped. He squeezed his eyes shut. He imagined the little girl with the braids. He imagined her hand stroking his fur. He focused on that phantom touch, anchoring himself to the only memory of kindness he had in this hellscape of physics and fire. The deceleration was brutal. It pressed the air out of his lungs. Darkness crept into the edges of his vision. He was a voyager at the edge of endurance. And then, the jolt. The parachutes deployed. It felt as though the capsule had been yanked backward by a giant hand. Barnaby was thrown forward against his restraints, the breath knocked out of him. The howling wind quieted to a rushing breeze. The violent shaking smoothed into a rhythmic swaying. Pendulum motion. Swing, swing. Barnaby blinked. The red haze in his vision faded. He was alive. But where was he? The landing was not soft. The capsule slammed into something solid, tipped over, and rolled. Metal screeched against rock. Dirt, blessed dirt, scraped against the outer hull. Then stillness. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't the dead silence of the void. It was a silence filled with tiny, almost imperceptible vibrations. Barnaby waited. He waited for the cold to return. He waited for the lack of air. Instead, he heard a sound. Tap, tap, tap. Rain. Rain hitting the metal skin of the ship. He uncurled slightly. His nose twitched. Through the ventilation ports, which had automatically opened upon landing, a scent drifted in. It smelled of wet pine needles. It smelled of damp soil. It smelled of life. He wasn't home, but he was back. It took 3 hours for the recovery team to reach the remote section of the Siberian wilderness where the capsule had come down. The helicopter blades whipped the trees into a frenzy as soldiers and scientists jumped into the mud, Geiger counters and medical kits in hand. They approached the scorched, blackened pod with trepidation. They had monitored the biosigns, but the sensors had gone dark during the rough landing. They feared the worst. The lead scientist, a man who had not slept in 3 days, reached for the release lever. With a hiss of equalizing pressure, the hatch popped open. The team peered inside, flashlights cutting through the gloom of the capsule's interior. There, in the center of the wreckage, amidst millions of dollars of fried electronics and charred insulation, sat Barnaby. He was trembling. His white fur was matted with sweat and dust. He looked small, insignificant against the backdrop of the technology that had almost killed him. The scientist reached out a gloved hand, moving slowly, terrified of startling the creature. "Hey there, buddy," the man whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "You went a long way." Barnaby didn't retreat. He didn't bite. He stretched his neck forward, his nose working overtime, analyzing the leather of the glove, the sweat of the human, the smell of the rain. He would appear on magazine covers. Schools would be named after him. The data gathered from his vitals would pave the way for human astronauts to safely travel to the moon and beyond. But Barnaby didn't care about the legacy. He was retired to a sanctuary, a large enclosure with heated soil and the finest clover imported from 3 different continents. He lived a long life for a rabbit, growing plump and slow in the safety of the earth. Yet, the caretakers noticed something strange about him in his later years. Most rabbits, at twilight, retreat into their burrows to hide from the coming night. They fear the owl and the fox. They fear the darkness. But Barnaby was different. On clear nights, when the moon was full and the Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of spilled milk, Barnaby would not go underground. He would sit in the center of his enclosure, perfectly still. He would tilt his head back, his black eyes reflecting the galaxies above. He would stare up at the vast, infinite ocean he had once navigated. He watched the stars not with the fear of a prey animal looking for a hawk, but with the quiet, knowing gaze of a traveler looking at a map of his hometown. He knew what was up there. He knew the silence. He knew the cold, and he knew that he had beaten it. The little girl with the braids, now a grown woman, would often come to visit him. She would sit by the fence as he stared at the sky. She wondered what he was thinking. She wondered if he remembered the G-force, the terror, the isolation. He probably didn't, not in the way humans do. He didn't have words for trajectory or apogee. But he knew the feeling of weightlessness. He knew that the world was just a blue marble in a sea of dark. And he knew that no matter how far you go, how high you fly, or how lost you become, there is nothing, absolutely nothing, as the smell of dirt after the rain. And so the rabbit who touched the face of God went back to eating his clover, content in the knowledge that while the sky belongs to the hawks, the earth belongs to the brave.